What we haven't shown yet, as far as I'm concerned, is evidence that the entire thing was deliberate. And I truly do not know. I think on the one hand, this looks to have been a virus whose origin is more North Carolina than Wuhan Institute. Doesn't mean the virus didn't emerge from the Wuhan Institute, and it doesn't mean that it didn't leak accidentally. On the other hand, Event 201 suggests somebody knew there was going to be a pandemic. It doesn't prove it, but it suggests it. So I wonder, do you think this leaked naturally from the Wuhan Institute?
Yeah, you raise very, very valid points, very good questions. I do believe that it was it's interesting, and you recently did an ex post on flagging a sort of DoD document where it actually states that the virus is an American-created recombinant bat vaccine or its precursor virus. This is to do with SARS-CoV-2 coming out of an EcoHealth Alliance program at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So the first two chapters of my book, Bret, I heavily go into the origin story. And I really look at what was this is Batwoman. Her name is Dr. Shi Zhengli, who was one of the leading scientists at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. What were they doing at the time? And you look at their sort of seminal papers they were writing. 2013, she wrote a paper with Peter Daszak, who was leading EcoHealth Alliance, a New York City nonprofit. And they were, essentially tinkering around with coronaviruses, getting, bat feces samples and doing what they were doing in the lab. But what you see is that in 2015, she wrote a paper with Ralph Barrick at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where they essentially take the backbone of a SARS virus, they replace its spike protein and put in a spike protein of a bat coronavirus. So they're developing a chimeric virus, two viruses together, and they're essentially saying, how can we make it more infectious? How can we, it's astounding what they were doing.
How can we make it infectious to people?
Yeah, exactly. They were using humanized mice and agents like that. So in the book, there is a reference to a significant memorandum written by, and this was around August 2021. He warned the Inspector General of the Department of Defense. This is Major Joseph Murphy, a former DARPA fellow, stating that SARS-CoV-2 is American created, and it's coming. It's essentially what your post was about, but actually the wording is lifted from the memorandum. Excuse me. So, and we know that this was going on. So, and he is referring, though, Major Murphy, to a EcoHealth Alliance grant proposal. So this is what they submitted to DARPA, and this is the Diffuse project. Now, this Diffuse project got leaked, I think, around the fall of 2021, and it was published on the Drastic, that online group Drastic, their website. And it essentially says that this is EcoHealth Alliance asking for $14 million, asking DARPA for money. It's going to be, stating they're going to be collaborating, with the Wuhan Institute of Virology, University of North Carolina. This is Ralph Barrick. And they're going to be essentially vaccinating bats. They're going to be taking lots of samples, but they're going to be doing basically gain of function studies. It's very overt.
I would say also, I don't mean to interrupt.
No, please.
That proposal describes exactly the virus that we saw.
Exactly.
It describes exactly the proposal to create exactly the virus we saw. The blueprint. Right. Now, it was rejected.
Yes.
The proposal was rejected, which does not mean what people think it means, because in science, the game of science funding often has people doing work before they get the grant.
Yes.
In other words, they do the work prospectively, then they propose it, then they get paid to do it, and it's already done. So the question is, did they actually do it? And then for whatever reason it was rejected, but then the world was exposed to the pandemic.
Yeah, that you raise a very good point. And what is also interesting, Bret, if you look at my timeline that I create at the beginning of the book, what do you think happens September 2019 at the Wuhan Institute of Virology? Do you know what went on?
Well, I did at one point know the timeline. I know that there is significant evidence that the virus was actually already circulating at the Wuhan Games in the fall of 2019. I know there was a shutdown around the Wuhan Institute.
So what was interesting is that, yes, just before the games, these are the military games you're talking about. I think that happened in October. In September, they had the world's biggest database of coronavirus samples, like that massive database. And it was Dr. Shi Zhengli, this is the Bat woman, the Bat lady, people refer her to, that gets shut down. That goes offline. So that is it kind of rings some alarm bells. Why were they suddenly shutting that down? What were they hiding? So there's a few red flags here, leading up to the event. It's just quite a lot of anomalies.
I should also add, since it will have been a long time since people have thought about this part of the story, there's a very telling moment early on before Xi Zhengli was effectively silenced by the CCP. She said that when she first got word of SARS-CoV-2 circulating, that she was terrified and unable to sleep out of fear that it may have leaked out of her lab, and that she then investigated and was greatly relieved to discover that it had not. I don't know whether to believe her. Actually, there's a part of me that does. And it is among the possibilities that are on the table, among the still standing viable hypotheses. The virus may have been released on Wuhan's doorstep in order effectively to frame them and to provide an alibi for Ralph Barrick and his lab at North Carolina. If that is what happened, it is then mysterious that the Chinese begin acting quite guilty, as if it is their virus. But I always wondered about whether actually Xi Zhengli was telling it like it is, and that the guilty behavior of the CCP was about something else, and whether or not, if Event 201 was indeed based on foreknowledge that there was going to be an emergency, that it was going to be useful to powerful forces, and that the Wuhan Institute was going to take the blame, then her reaction would make perfect sense. That this is a virus that could conceivably have leaked from Wuhan, but it didn't. So if we are to get to the bottom of the story, I would love to know the answer to that question, because, of course, if this came from Ralph Barrick's lab and it was dropped in Wuhan intentionally, then the question is, what was the purpose of this? And that goes straight to your point about control.
Absolutely.